Welcome, everyone, to this third and final event in this year's Virginia Tech Civil War Weekend, the virtual edition this year, of course. I'm Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which sponsors the weekend. And Virginia Tech has been holding the Civil War Weekend every March since 1991. Of course, with the exception of last year, we had to cancel in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And this year, of course, we're holding the weekend, but it feels a little bit different. And as I've said on previous weeks, I really miss seeing everyone in person. I miss the spirit we have at the Inn at Virginia Tech. I miss the conversations around meals as well as in the lecture hall. But I'm really glad we're able to do this at least, and also really glad about the silver lining of these Zoom events, which is that we're able to reach more people who otherwise wouldn't be able to attend Civil War Weekend. So whether you've been attending for years and years, and I know some of you out there have, or maybe this is your first time, you're very welcome to be with us tonight. And just a quick reminder that next year we are going to return to normal. We'll have an in-person gathering. It's going to be March 25th through 27th, 2022. And it's going to be a really special event for two reasons. First of all, of course, it's going to be the first time together in person after 1 year of cancellation, 1 year of virtual programming. But even more so, it's going to be special because the event is going to be a tribute to a person who is really very special in the life of the Civil War Center, the person who founded the Civil War Center, Dr. James I. Bud Robertson, Jr. And not only did he found the center, he also began this tradition of Civil War Weekend. So next year, again, March 25th through 27th, 2022, we're going to meet. It's going to be a special opportunity to honor, to remember, to commemorate Dr. Robertson's many contributions to Virginia Tech, but also to the field of Civil War history as well. Well, this year we've met, and some of you have been with us each week. Some of you are new here today, but this year we've met each of the last 3 Thursdays over Zoom, and each week has featured 3 different speakers. And they've all addressed the same overarching theme, which is resources for war. So that was kind of the challenge I gave to the speakers, was think about what Americans needed in order to wage war against one another in the 1860s. So the first week we had 3 presentations on the theme of manpower and horsepower. And then last week we turned to tangible resources. And this week our theme is intangible resources. So this is, I feel, where the speakers got really creative, and we're going to hear talks on information, love, and memory. So 3 things that you might not immediately think of as wartime resources, but when you think a little harder, I think it's obvious that these are the kinds of things that Americans, whether they're soldiers or civilians in the Union or the Confederacy, black and white Americans alike, needed in order to cope with the tremendous crisis of the Civil War. So we'll have 3 talks. Each of them will last about 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll move into a period of discussion. And the discussion, by the way, is going to be moderated jointly by me and Dr. Caroline Newhall, my colleague. She's the postdoctoral fellow here at the center. And you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time now, if you already have a question, but certainly any time during the lectures or at the end during the discussion session. And I really want to let you know how much we appreciate your responses and questions that come in through the Q&A box. You know, sometimes people just type a little note saying, I really enjoyed this talk, and that's great, of course, for the speakers to hear. And whatever your response or question, we're really glad to have it. And of course, especially over Zoom, if we don't get any questions or responses, it really makes us question whether there's anyone out there at all. So please do keep those questions and responses coming. We really look forward to the conversation after the lectures. So our first speaker is going to be extremely familiar to anyone who's attended Virginia Tech Civil War Weekend before, William C. Jack Davis. Until 2013, he was executive director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. That's when I took over. And he's the author or editor of more than 50 books. His latest is on the Battle of New Orleans. He's also the recipient of many awards in our field, including a record 4 Jefferson Davis Awards from the American Civil War Museum. And I know you all are going to enjoy hearing from Jack. I also want to say how grateful I am that he's continued to be such a presence at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. When he retired in 2013, he could have mounted up and ridden off into the sunset, but he's stuck around and just been a really welcome element of continuity, especially at these Civil War weekends. So thank you so much for being with us, Jack. And his title tonight is Information, How They Knew What They Knew. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much. I'm enjoying looking at you on the screen because I see an awful lot of old friends behind you. I think when I left that office, I left about half of those books behind. And possessions are chains, and I got rid of some of them. Now they're your problem, I'm afraid. But you can tell I'm still burdened with them. I'm going to chat for about 15 minutes about how they knew what they knew, or what they thought they knew. The Americans of that era were already an information-hungry people who had multiple avenues by which they could learn what was going on in the world around them. And when the war interrupted that, it created quite a disruption for a lot of people. When Washington was first cut off in April 1861, after the secession of Virginia, they were 6 days without any incoming information from outside. Imagine Washington today with no information for a period of 6 days. April 29, 1861, a local newspaper decried the barbarism of tearing up railroad tracks, destroying telegraph wires and batteries, burning bridges, sinking ships, and capturing steamboats, because it deprives us of all the opportunities of hearing from our family and friends and of knowing what's happening in our world. There was no mail, no newspapers from out of town, no telegrams. There were hardly even rumors. And of course, whenever you have a vacuum like that, an informational vacuum, then or today, what first takes over are in fact rumors. That would be a whole separate topic itself, because our ancestors, just as much as we do today, lived on gossip. They didn't have People magazine and the National Enquirer, but the fact remains that they were extremely interested in all of the sorts of things that the average American is today that he probably shouldn't be interested in. Rumors were not a good source for people to learn things. They certainly weren't a good source for the military or for the people in Washington and Richmond running this war to have to depend on. But a great deal of it came into those capitals, and it had to be sifted and sorted and discarded when possible. Though in fact, a great deal of it was never discarded, and you still find it turning up in memoirs that they wrote years after the war. They had, because of an information dearth, no real means of sifting the good from the bad. I won't talk a lot about rumors, but they're interesting. They say a lot about what people want to believe, as opposed perhaps to what they should believe. And you can actually follow rumors in the Army in particular to see how they work. My favorite, there are 2 or 3, well, actually there's about half a dozen instances in which a rumor starts that a Union soldier somewhere in the ranks gave birth to a baby. It may sound like a pretty difficult thing to have happen, but it's certainly not theoretically impossible. None of the soldiers involved have ever been identified, but for instance, in January 1863, the rumor starts in Hooker's army over on the left flank of his army. And the story is that it's a New Jersey soldier who's given birth to a baby. You can follow in letters and diaries that rumor as it moves across the army from the left of Hooker's army to the right. And while it's doing it, this new recruit, as he's called, the baby, suddenly shifts from being born to a soldier in a New Jersey regiment to being born to a soldier in a Wisconsin regiment. By May, it's a private from Vermont who's given birth to the child. And before long, it actually took place not in Hooker's army, but on Ship Island off the Mississippi coast. Rumors once going like that just go on indefinitely. We will never know if there's any basis in fact to it or not, but soldiers really believe this. Mail, of course, is a whole lot more useful a great deal more important. It's probably the single closest tie between the soldiers and their families at home. You're going to hear a talk about love as an element of the war, and letters played an enormous role as transmission sources, transmitters, conveyances of love from soldier to home and from home back to soldier. To the point that letter writing, which again is a whole separate topic, became so important that some soldiers would write letters every day when they had nothing to say, and they'll say that. I seat myself and take pen in hand to tell you I am fine. The letter writers usually did one or two things. They said they were feeling good, and they gave a report on the condition of their digestive system, because everybody's obsessed with their digestive system in that era. And then the soldier might ask how his wife or sweetheart or parents' digestive systems are working as well. I won't do a separate talk on digestion in the Civil War, but there's probably something there. The letter writing becomes so compulsive that soldiers who can't write dictate letters to friends who can, so that information can be passed home, or they'll have friends read letters from home that they can't read themselves. And some of you may have even seen these famous examples of what's called cross-writing, in which a soldier was limited in paper, so he'd write one way on a piece of paper, turn it a quarter turn, write across all that, turn it a quarter turn again, and do this on both sides of the paper. It's almost impossible for historians to make anything out of this because it's all so jumbled up. But they had all that information to impart, or more to the point, I think it was that important to them to maintain that sort of psychological connection with their loved ones at home that they could feel while they were in the act of writing. I don't know if we feel that today when we're texting our loved ones or not, but perhaps we do. Newspapers are far more important. And you've all probably seen Civil War newspapers, I'm sure. One newspaper said, "We are traders in news, and the proprietors of newspapers have naturally an anxiety to produce a valuable article for their customers." There was an explosion of literacy after 1830, with the coming of pretty much universal free public education, North and South, with the result that the hunger for newspapers was enormous. In 1860, there were more than 3,000 newspapers being published, North and South. There were 387 daily newspapers. Just imagine the effort involved in setting type by hand day after day for an all new issue, which of course they didn't always do. They often repeated stories in successive issues of a newspaper. There are 387 dailies. Interestingly, only 70 of them are in the states that will form the Confederacy. There's a little less demand for news now, or slightly less literacy, less demand for news, and of course, less investment in the expense of operating a press. There are dailies, there are weekly newspapers, there are what they call tri-weekly newspapers, which appeared 3 times a week. There are even press associations. I think United Press International is long gone now. I think the Associated Press is still around. The Associated Press was around in the Civil War era. In the Confederacy in 1862, they founded the Southern Associated Press. These are clearinghouses to sort of bring article information in and then to disseminate it to the newspapers who paid to subscribe to their service. Same sort of thing that happens today in the world with Reuters and Associated Press and whatnot. And some of the circulation is pretty impressive. The New York Tribune had a circulation of 200,000 readers, 200,000 subscribers, which was more subscribers than those of all the Southern newspapers combined. But to operate, the newspaper depended upon 2 vital elements to get information out to people at large, and also information to the people in high circles in Washington and Richmond, who gleaned a lot of their information about the enemy from what was unwisely published in enemy newspapers, and then those newspapers found their way across the lines. One of the elements responsible for getting the press out, of course, is the railroad, which is the dominant, driving, powerful engine of industry at that time. The other is the telegraph. And because relatively little is understood even today, I think, about the mechanics of the telegraph and what it could, and more to the point, what it could not do, I'm going to talk a little more at length about that. In 1851, the United States had 22,000 miles of telegraph wire hung. Imagine 20, of course, that's nothing to us today. But imagine it in that era, the time and expense and effort of stringing that much wire. And in 1851, it was claimed that an impulse on a telegraph wire could travel 13,000 miles per second. I don't know if that's true. It's halfway around the world. But the point is, an electronic impulse over a copper wire could travel just as fast then as it can today. The Hughes printing telegraph, which was introduced in 1855, it wasn't just the kind that went click, 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 click. It actually, when it received an impulse, it would print like a typewriter, the letters of what was coming in. It was introduced in 1855, and it could transmit 500 miles with good batteries. In Europe, by the time the war began, a message could go from Vienna to Zurich and back in 4 hours. Only a few seconds or a few minutes of that was actually transmission. The rest of it was the human component, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It took batteries, of course, to operate these things. The batteries usually ran on about 100 to 160 volts. They were simply something like jars of the appropriate chemicals connected that would produce a current. A telegraph battery could cost $98. Some could cost $300. This was not an inexpensive endeavor, which meant that the cost of sending a telegram ran about 13 cents a word. I wonder if we would be texting as much today if it cost us 13 cents a word to do it. In 1864, the new transatlantic cable, could transmit 8 words a minute from New York to Ireland at a cost of $1 a word. So that's slow by today's standards, but still information is moving very, very fast compared to the couple of weeks it could take for a ship to bring news from one side of the Atlantic to the other. There was an impulse. No impulse could get from Washington to Louisville over direct wires. Here's another problem people don't understand about the telegraph, because the wires would break at many stops along the way, because the wires would come into a town. If the telegraph operator there was already using it, no message could pass through until the telegraph operator was done doing what he was doing, or he would have to stop and reconnect the wires into and out of town, rather the way you switch engines off the track so that a train could go straight through without having to stop to wait, which meant that notifications had to pass all along the lines to operators to close their connections so that important messages could pass. And even then, telegraph communications had to sort of go all around depending on where the wires went. A telegram from Texas went to Philadelphia via New Orleans. There were 20 or 30 lines coming into Philadelphia from all over the country. It was pretty much the telegraphic center by the time the war began. In the Confederacy, lines went from outside Washington to New Orleans to Memphis, from Richmond to Bristol, Bristol to Chattanooga, Chattanooga to Atlanta, Richmond to Stanton. They were limited, and it meant that telegrams often had to go all over the place to get where they were headed. So there's a notion that we need to disabuse ourselves of, that somehow people with the telegraph could communicate instantaneously. They could not. It's still very fast. By 1861, there's more than 100 main and branch lines, and there's over 50,000 miles of wire on telegraph poles at the time the war began. Those wires could carry 4 million messages a year. That's an information explosion. Doesn't sound like much to us today. It's probably 4 million every second on texting. But in that era, that is an enormous body of information moving all around the continent. They had a saying at the time that business of all kinds moved at railroad speed because the railroad was so fast. but that changed to say businesses moving at telegraph speed. It was the epitome, the symbol of modern speed. However widespread and successful use of the device was, it still required a unified system of telegraph stations among which information could be transmitted. The Western Union Telegraph Company, founded just before the war, was at first only one of many such companies that would develop during the war around this new medium. But by 1861, Western Union virtually dominated that industry and had already laid the first transcontinental telegraph line, making it the first nationwide information source in our history. As with all other great technological innovations, not everyone saw the potential of this new form of almost instantaneous long-distance communication. In 1858, the New York Times, always the harbinger of reliable information, called the telegraph superficial, sudden, unsifted, and too fast for the truth. So if you learn things quickly, they can't be true. It may still be true today. There was a distrust of what came over the wires. People new to this electronic dawn really didn't quite get the connection between electricity and something coming into their home or into their town, bringing them information. Companies, of course, could only transmit what they receive, and to try to prevent false information from being disseminated, telegraph operators came to require that there be responsible signatures by a general or someone like that to transmit military information. There was a perceived problem that operators might be putting news of their own on the telegraph wires or altering what they were given, changing the truth or character of the dispatches. So the telegraph operator was regarded just about as important as the post office in doing the job of getting information out to the people who needed it. In 1862, it was declared in a Washington newspaper that the telegraph lines are important government weapons, and the government should see that they are not intentionally nor recklessly used. This, of course, eventually will lead to government oversight and censorship of what travels over the telegraph lines, both in the North and in the South during the war, because important military and naval projects had suffered because of indiscriminate transmission of information that shouldn't have been revealed publicly. There's a lot of misunderstanding then and since as to how the telegraph worked and what it could do. It was said at the time, which everybody got a kick out of, that Henry Halleck and General McClellan and General Don Carlos Buell conversed back and forth on the telegraph for hours during the battle at Fort Donelson, and that they, in fact, issued all the orders and dispositions that led to Grant's victory, which, of course, is nonsense. And one observer commented on the nonsense by saying, "I should rejoice at the news that General McClellan had done any fighting, even if it was just with a telegraph battery, let alone a Confederate battery." Then that asked, how are these wires connected with Grant's headquarters in the field? Well, of course they weren't. But later in the war, telegraph lines would run right to the Army headquarters in the field in order to provide the fastest possible transmission of information to and from Washington. Grant made a good deal of thunder and lightning of his own, said this commentator. He cares very little for the electricity of the telegraph batteries. That's not true. He depended on the telegraph greatly. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with the so-called Great Locomotive Chase in 1862, when the Federal raiders tried to steal a locomotive in Atlanta and bring it back to Chattanooga, destroying track and bridges behind them, and also destroying telegraph lines. And interestingly, Engineer Fuller, the Confederate who chased them down, took along with him a telegraph operator, so he was able to get the wires back up and to get word back to Atlanta constantly of what was going on as he tried to catch up to the raiders. Whenever Union or Confederate raiders entered enemy territory, the local telegraph operators along the way were the first to be taken prisoner and their equipment either destroyed to keep word from getting out, or else the Confederates themselves made an attempt to make use of those lines by putting an experienced telegraph operator on them to send false information to the north. You've all heard of Lightning Ellsworth, the man who rode with John Hunt Morgan's raiders, who would climb a pole with a telegraph key cut into a federal line and start sending misinformation over the line to the enemy. It even entered Civil War humor. I'm now going to give you a couple of examples of Civil War humor, and even over this medium, I just expect to hear and see you all bowled over with belly laughs. One is, why is it vulgar to send a telegram? The answer is because it is making use of flash language. There's a real rip snorter. In February 1865, to show how little many people really understood what's happening with the telegraph, a man in Portland, Maine walked into the local telegraph office and handed the clerk a sealed letter in a large envelope ornamented with cooing doves, cupids with no pants, etc., and asked the clerk to send it to an addressee by telegraph as quickly as he could. The addressee was a unnamed young lady. He didn't care about the expense. Well, the clerk started to break the seal on the letter so he could open it to send the message, when the man demanded to know what he was doing. Why, you wish the letter sent, don't you? Asked the clerk. The man said, yes, but there's something in it I don't want nobody to see but Miss whatever her name was. The clerk responded, we can't send the letter without opening it. Whereupon the man said, well, then give it back to me and I'll send it by mail. Report of this said that the man's ideas of the capacity of the telegraph were decidedly exalted. Tens of millions of telegrams were sent by the end of the war. The armies moved on it, as did commerce, politics, human daily life, and more. And thanks to the telegraph, far more even than newspapers, I think we can justly regard the Civil War as being able to lay claim to inaugurating the information age. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Jack, and special thanks for not using any flash language in your Civil War jokes tonight. Our second speaker is actually another great friend of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, Dr. Angela Esco Elder. She worked here in 2016 to 17 as a postdoc, so the same job Caroline Newhall is doing now. And she went on to become an assistant professor of history at Converse College. She's the co-editor of a book called Practical Strangers, the courtship correspondence of Nathaniel Dawson and Elodie Todd, who's the sister of Mary Todd Lincoln. And right now she's putting the finishing touches on what's going to be a terrific book about Confederate widows. And I would recommend it to you all as soon as it comes out. Drop what you're doing and read it immediately. Her topic tonight is Love as a Battlefield, Love as a Resource for War. Thanks very much for being here. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right, there we go. So thank you so much for inviting me, for having me. It is such a treat to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion after our final presentation. As Paul mentions, I was lucky enough to meet some of you in 2017, and so it's good to be back, even if it's just virtually. This is such a special group for sure. So, as Paul mentioned, most of my research has been about death, so really uplifting stuff. And the bulk of my work has been looking at women who suffered loss, right? So by studying widowhood, by definition, I wasn't looking for the happily ever afters. I was looking for the death do us parts. But in reading these letters and studying all of these different relationships, I did gain a deep appreciation for what a tangible effect these intangibles had on soldiers and had on their wives. And so I'm going to take my 15 minutes to talk about love as a resource for war. And as you can see here, the title of my talk, yes, it is inspired by, whoops, let me get it to click, there it goes, singer Pat Benatar, and I promise I won't sing for you. But the lyrics, I think, echo in interesting ways with this topic, right? So if you're familiar with the song, she sings about youth, she sings about heartache and promises and demands, and all of these themes echo with 19th century letters in really interesting ways. And so tonight my talk is going to fall into two loose parts. First, love as a resource for war, as something that is supporting soldiers, and then love as a source of conflict. So to begin, we know that emotional support mattered to soldiers, right? There aren't many things that unite all soldiers, but I think, and if you've read letters in the Civil War, you might have noticed this too, almost every soldier husband, in addition to talking about digestion, if they could hold a pen, if they are white or black or Confederate or Union, they had the same complaint, and that was that their wives never wrote them enough. They never received enough letters. And they constantly are complaining about the mail, right? That they're not getting enough mail, or that they're missing letters, that they're urging their loved ones to write them more often. And when we read these letters, when we're looking through all of this information, there's the reports of the everyday happenings of their homes, there's the local gossip, right, from their communities, but there's also these constant assurances and reassurances that the soldier was terribly missed and utterly adored. And so a surprising number of men, of soldiers, rushed to the altar right at the start of this war. And so here, one example, as William writes to his intended Georgia, a war is fast approaching. Oh, let me claim you as my own. Let me have the right to protect you and shield you by my earnest love. And then also later on, do not let any slight obstacles or conventionalities prevent you from being mine as soon as you can. We know not what may happen. And as we can see here, she agrees, right? I feared that you all might not approve. She's writing to her brothers at this point, but my heart relented. And so Georgia would marry him in July of 1861 and write pages and pages and pages of letters to him during the war. And Georgia and William represent a more elite couple, but even barely educated men sought these same kinds of assurances of emotional support that letters carried from home. In a time when so much was out of their control, they craved that tangible piece of paper asserting that they were not forgotten, that they were loved, that they were cared for, and that they were missed. And so here, Melinda is writing to her husband. They are from Alabama, a poor farming family. And as you can see, we have some creative spelling here. And also important detail to know is that she is pregnant at the time. So you need that information to kind of get a sense of what she's saying, right? So I wish you could come home, for I am as fat as a pig in a pen. I would write some which would make you laugh, but I'm afraid some man would see it. I want to come before I get too big so you can hug me good. I am getting pretty big around. I'm afraid you can't get your arms around me. My dear Harris, do burn up this letter when you read it. Whoops, that didn't happen. How I wish I was with you. I would eat a piece of you. And so the spelling might be a little bit unique here, but the sentiments are the same, right? These are sentiments that we see in hundreds and thousands of other letters that are received by soldiers. And when we think about expressions of love in the war, many of us think of the famous Sullivan Ballou letter, which I can't even begin to match that deep narration of the Ken Burns film, so I'm not going to try. So channel him as you read this, right? Sarah, my love for you is deathless. My dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, nor that when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. And so Sullivan, famously of Rhode Island, is not going to survive this war. And then, of course, on the Confederate side, letters like this: my heart's most precious darling, you are the light and delight of my life. I live for you, and oh, your love makes life so delightful for me. Or here, Nathaniel Dawson, right? She is my country, and without her, I would have no country to live for and to die for. I would make a better soldier if you were now my wife, as you could take publicly an interest in my welfare and not be subjected to many annoyances that must now disturb you. And so that one in particular, we can see more clearly the connection between wife and country. Here, Dawson outlines that his fiance could make him a better soldier, that he believes if they were married, if she was championing him publicly as her husband, that would affect the way that he fought. And we know that these letters were dear to soldiers because of the sentiments and the connection that they represented. And many soldiers, they keep these letters with them at all costs, right? They read them over and over again. They sleep with them under their pillows. They tuck them by their hearts in their uniforms. They kissed them and they died with them. And so one of the most powerful letters that I came across was from an archive in Savannah, Georgia, from C. Ann Butler, who writes, it's a longer letter, here's an excerpt. I have waited and longed and longed and waited for a letter from you, but seems all in vain. Relieve my anxious mind. The children are all anxious to see you. I will say no more, but will trust in the Lord for the safekeeping of both us and our little flock. And so Anne lived with her children in a freedmen's village in Arlington, Virginia during the war. Her husband, William, served in Company H of the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops. And this letter, and here's another view of it, the original. This letter was removed from a knapsack found close to a body on a battlefield. William did not survive the war. He was killed at the Battle of Natural Bridge in Florida. And so we have a lot of these, right? These expressions of love, of support, and I could share them all night. But like all marriages, not all emotional expressions were supportive all of the time, right? This is getting to the idea that love can also be a battlefield of sorts, right? We don't often share the stories of conflict between spouses during the war, but we know that not every wartime marriage was happy. We know that the war brought a great deal of stress into marriages, some of which were already on really unsteady ground. And even at the most basic level, we need to acknowledge that not all wartime marriages were love matches. You might think of the famous, right, Scarlett O'Hara, or you might think of women from the actual 19th century who rush into marriage, like Miss Brown here, who would lament, if I can get anybody to have me, you shall get to a wedding. But there is nobody about here, only some old widowers, for all the young men has gone to the army. Or Easter Alden of South Carolina, who wrote, one looks at a man so differently when you think he may be killed tomorrow. Men whom up to this time I had thought dull and commonplace seemed charming. So not all marriages started with a deep understanding, love, or even a knowledge of one another. Even Nathaniel Dawson, when he is courting Elodie Todd, writing all of those oversaturated love letters, trying to get her to marry him, saying that she is his country, Elodie tries to correct him. I am a troublesome somebody at all times, she assures him. I am a Todd. And some of these days, you may be unfortunate enough to find out what they are, right? And there is trouble in marriages, things, problems, issues that would preoccupy soldiers, taking their minds away from the task at hand. So take these letters, right, from William, written to his wife Fanny when he is away fighting at war. Tell Pamela that her good opinion of me is tenfold returned. I think her the prettiest woman I have yet seen and the most lovable one. Pamela was Fanny, his wife's younger sister. There are a lot of beautiful girls here. He's in Virginia at the time he's writing this. There are a lot of beautiful girls here and a good many fine horses. So when I have nothing else to do, I can look at something beautiful or fine. Dined today with the most beautiful girl in Suffolk, and it was a great many very pretty ones. The ladies keep my table covered with flowers and smile on me in the most bewitching manner. In the same letter, he expressed concern for his wife, who had just given birth. Honey, I hope they have not let your figure be spoiled by not keeping your bandage sufficiently tight. Do not lose your figure. And so this is one of those moments where I lament that we are on Zoom, because I wish I could see all of your faces, especially the women in the crowd, at that comment, right? Yikes. As you can imagine, Fanny was not pleased to get these letters home from her husband. And so she finally writes back. Now I ask you candidly, in your sober sense, why you wrote me such a thing as that? Was it to gratify your vanity by making me jealous, or to make me appreciate your love still more? You are very much mistaken. I feel indignant that any woman should have dared to make such loose speeches to my husband, and that he should have encouraged it by his attentions. For you must have gone pretty far for a woman to attempt such a liberty. I can never forget that letter. Nothing you have ever said, nothing you have ever done, nothing you have ever written in this whole of our married life ever pained me so acutely or grieved me so deeply. This would set off a chain of very apologetic letters from her husband, who attempts to do much better in his future letters home. One more example. Here, James Edward Raines is writing to his wife, and he is really unhappy about a letter that he has received from her. And unfortunately, we don't have her original letter. We just have his interpretation of this letter, where she apparently had been complaining about how he was spending the money, that she felt he was wasting it on hats and other clothing items. Right? And so he writes, I have received your unkind letter. You scold me very severely when I am with you, but I did not think that you would write me such a letter at a time when I may be called away from you, perhaps forever. Under all these circumstances, I do think your scolding exceedingly unkind and undeserved. I will endeavor to live on salt pork and stale bread, and you will have all you want. So, just like the love letters that I started with, there are also many more examples of these more complicated letters, right? But for the sake of time, to start wrapping up and to recap, love affected soldiers. We know this, but how often do we really think about it, right? We know that a letter from home could distract them. It could upset them, as we see here. It could call them home to desert, or it could be something that supported them in a particularly trying time. We know that effective soldiers needed physical support, right? Food, shelter, shoes. But I would argue that these intangibles, like love, mattered just as much. For as soldier Frank Schaller wrote to his sweetheart, who he also was trying to convince to marry, now prepare for it. I am in earnest. Every day I feel more reluctant to go into an uncertain life without having the consciousness of being yours entirely. I could fight better, and I would do everything better. He would be shot off his horse at Shiloh, but he would survive the war. And so I will stop there, but I look forward to talking about all of this more in just a little bit. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Two great talks to start us off. We're already getting some excellent questions in. Feel free to keep them coming. Our final speaker tonight is Dr. Hilary Green, and most of the time she's an associate professor in the Department of Gender and Race Studies at the University of Alabama. But this year she is serving as Vann Professor of Ethics in Society at Davidson College. She's the author of a book called Educational Reconstruction, African American Schools in the Urban South from 1865 to 1890. And right now she's working on a book about how African Americans remembered the Civil War. And we're very fortunate tonight. We're going to get a sneak peek at some of the ideas and content of that book with her talk, which is entitled Unforgettable: The Diversity of African American Civil War Memory. Thanks so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for allowing me to come and speak to you. And thank you in the audience for being willing to entertain some early preliminary thoughts of this oncoming book. And one of the things that I wanted to is talk about how the diversity of African American remembrances of the Civil War, it represents the diversity of the people themselves. And our current day categories, whether it's the emancipationists that David Blight has come up with, or the one cause from that Barb Gannon has, those are your bookends. But there's a lot of gray in between. And those categories tend to flatten the diversity that it was of how everyday people remembered the Civil War and commemorated it, but it also has reduced African American memory of the Civil War as the losers to the cultural wars of the Civil War, dominated by the lost cause and the reconciliations and traditions that have been discussed ad nauseum, from historians like Karen Cox's new book to Karen Janney and David Blight and others. So one of the things I would like to do tonight in my brief remarks is to talk about a site that's important for understanding the African American memories, that diversities. And it's a site of one that doesn't always get looked at: the African American porch. This is an important site of Civil War memory because it's where porches in the Black community, where oral tradition has been shared of the Civil War, and it passes down from generations. And it's through these familial stories told on porches or at the churches or at schools that are then reinforced in segregated spaces like the church, the classroom, as well as fraternal orders and women's organizations. And then more formally within the African American press, with the advent of radio program that then gets recorded and put on vinyl and then played in classrooms. And then we have now current day documentaries, television series, and others, but we still have this undercurrent of the porch that remains a central place to tell these stories, to hear these histories, and the source of a lot of remembrance. Because the porch shows that African Americans refused to do something that the reconciliationists and the lost cause apologists wanted them to do, and that was to forget. To forget the African American men who served as soldiers, the civilians who supported them, the women who made clothes for them, and to fight. And so that, I think, is important for understanding this time, because to forget is something they refuse to do. To remember is their politics and their source to fight and to remember and to pursue a better, just world, and to keep the Civil War accessible to those who need it in their everyday life. And by recognizing the African American porch as an archival space of Civil War memory, alongside traditional archives and digital collections, in particular digital newspapers, as well as small collections in like this of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, that we get people like Joseph Winters comes to the fore. Joseph Winters, you might know him in his role in the John Brown meeting with Frederick Douglass in Chambersburg. It is at his quarry that they meet. Winters helps with that meeting because he knew John Brown. But what is less known about Winters is that he used songs and poetry to acknowledge and to remember the Civil War. In particular, when three Confederate invasions come into Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Because as a survivor of the Gettysburg campaign in particular, he would write the campaign song 10 Days After Gettysburg that will become the title of his autobiography. And while I have not seen his autobiography, I have the text of his song that was sold and published and sold widely. He then publishes a song to recruit USCT soldiers that will train at Camp William Penn, including his own son. And then after the Civil War, as we see in the right there, when Abraham Lincoln dies, he will eulogize Abraham Lincoln with another song. And then, because Black men get the right to vote, Joseph Winters uses that civilian trauma, the recruitment of Black soldiers, and how he used lyrics and songs to help mobilize Black men to vote, and to vote in very particular presidential elections. One of his most notable ones will be for the Garfield and Chester Arthur campaign of 1880, in which people remember at the time and into the 20th century as being a call to arms for Black men, Black veterans, Black men to assert themselves, to remember the war, and to vote for Garfield. But when the Pennsylvania Republican Party failed to fully incorporate Black men like Winters, who expected certain things out of the Civil War and how they remembered their trauma and reshaping of the world, Joseph Winters did something different. He leaves the Republican Party and joins the Democratic Party. And yet he still writes campaign songs, as the one on the left here. This is for Bryan and Stevenson. And so William Jennings Bryan, he's writing a song, and he will die in his early 90s as a Democrat. This man survives slavery, survives his trauma, but uses the song to remember the Civil War, in particular to pass the Black experience, to mobilize local communities, but to acknowledge their pain, their trauma, their service. Then we have here this photograph that's from around 1905 in Norfolk, Virginia, of GAR members from North Carolina and Virginia. And they are the living monuments of the Civil War, because it's these men who organize in these organizations, are in parades, but their most important role is that of parenting, and parenting their own children, but then the children of their communities. And they would use those porches to share to the next generation, this is how you survive. This is what my experience was like. This was what our experience was like. And this is what happened because of our service, our sacrifice. And as Jim Crow has come in about, remember our sacrifice and what we did, and arm yourself accordingly in this current day fight. And especially with the lost cause and the construction of monuments, while African Americans, very few constructed monuments. There's one in Hereford, North Carolina. There's one here in Norfolk, Virginia. They use the people, they use the cemeteries. That story, the porch, really, it communicates this. And this is where Carter G. Woodson is important, because in the 1943 Negro History Bulletin, he writes a very personal reflection piece of how he heard from his father and the other Civil War veterans in his orbit on the porch about the true Civil War that wasn't written. Then he read those early Black history books of the time about what the Civil War meant. But it was the porch that he remembered, those conversations with his father, those conversations with these veterans that helped really let the mark on him that will shape his whole trajectory. And as he's training, going to Harvard, he comes back and he would create the Black History Movement. And we know this from the organizations that still exist: the African American Association for Negro Life and History, the Lasalle, the Journal of African American History, then the Journal of Negro History, the Journal, the Negro History Bulletin for teachers, but more importantly, Negro History Week that we celebrate today as Black History Month. And it's in that publishing of Black scholarship, the professionalization of these memories, to get to comprehend and fight against the propaganda of the American profession that was white and rejected Black members. He turns to the classroom and the role of teachers to spread this message and to make sure that children in those early grades could get a curriculum of empowerment by providing resources for the teachers who were there to teach it. So Negro History Week and those pageants rely heavily on Black women who are in the classroom teaching. And without the professional arm and providing places for scholars to publish their work because they're left shut out, you have this generation taking the porch and those knowledges of the porch to the classroom and empowering a generation of people that will become future scholars, future activists, but future citizens. And it's there, I think, the important role of Woodson in targeting Classrooms Matter, because it will be Black women who are essential for the preservation of Civil War memory. They are the teachers, the parents, the mothers of the church. They are also the community archivists. And as we talk about these large state archives, it's their scrapbooks, it's their photography, their photo albums, and those histories and making sure the next generation hears these stories. So it's Black women like Edna Christian Napper, who's featured here, the daughters of former enslaved people. And one of the things I really like about her is that she, in 1956, a former retired educator, publishes a 15-week series of Black history in the white newspaper of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And she introduced white and Black Chambersburg residents and Franklin County residents of the stories that were quite comfortably shared in Black spaces. And it's in here, she introduces audiences to Taylor Curtis, another survivor of one of the Confederate raids into Chambersburg that saw the enslavement of African Americans. But she recalled in this very personal note that he loved telling his story, but singing a song, Wait for the Wagon, and how he used the wagon in his escape and successful being evasion from not being captured. And it's in this nugget in a newspaper that's printed over 15 weeks in 1956, she introduces people to the USCC soldiers, to who came back to the community and became police officers, her parents who were enslaved in Virginia, but creatively helped to sabotage and lead to the destruction of slavery in their communities. She talks about the civilians, and this is presented as Black history as knowledge. And she shaped generations of Black and white children in the area. And in 1980, a community volume starts to publish these stories and these community histories that she was a part of. And they, in their acknowledgements, they acknowledge Edna Napper for what she did and telling them and keeping this history alive. And so as the last USCT veterans die off, it's these women who are important. They are the ones sharing those histories. They're the ones publishing these stories. They are the ones who are the community archivists that I am drawing on in the archives today that are now in formal places. And it's because of their work and their labor, we can now better appreciate these two remembrances in 1989. Carl J. Cruz, the descendant of William Carney of the Massachusetts 54, George Corbell, who was the descendant of Eli Biddle of the Massachusetts 54. And when in Folly Beach, South Carolina, the bodies of what was then later discovered the Massachusetts 55th Regiment was found, they are reinterred in Beaufort National Cemetery. And these men participate in that ceremony alongside Governor Michael Dukakis, and they are able to record in mass newspapers their understandings. And Cruz's oral history is now in the Massachusetts State Archives, but also in some newspapers at the time. And they can remember and say how their families used the porch and why they knew that. And Biddle, his Civil War ancestor, was 94 when he died, so he was able to march alongside of him in the Memorial Day celebrations. Both of these men are in their 80s, the time that they published this, but the porch still holds sway. And this is where I think we need to go further. We need to reckon with the porch, because these individuals that I discussed tonight, the Civil War was unforgettable. And as such, we need to remember them. We need to learn their names, document them as the preservers of Civil War memory, not just the victims of the lost cause and reconciliation's understanding of it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. These were fantastic talks. I'm really excited to dive into the Q&A with all of you. So thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you, Dr. Davis, Dr. Elder. I'll start off with a question for Dr. Davis, if that's all right. So I had a question about the use of postage and stamps. Was there any expense that private soldiers incurred themselves when sending mail, or was this something that was provided for them through the Army? What were the general costs of communication during the war?
The private soldiers had to pay for their own transmission of their own mail. It varied. I think in the North it was a letter traveled for 3 cents. In the Confederacy, it varied depending on distance. I think pretty much the standard rate was about 10 cents. And it's still, the letters are still being delivered today. One interesting thing that you find in a lot of Confederate letters, but I think in Union letters too, I just haven't seen it this much, is that the instance of the soldier sending postage home in his letter to his wife or his sweetheart, presumably because A, maybe she can't afford it, or B, as a not so subtle inducement to please write back to me. I really want to hear from you. A colleague and I just finished editing a massive, it's 520 letters exchanged between Confederate General Gabriel Wharton and his young wife, Nanny Radford. And he's constantly sending her postage, and it's still stuck on the letter. She never used it. But he was able to send his letters to her via a military courier that happened to be going past where she lived anyhow. So there's a wide variation. Military correspondence did not require postage, north or south.
Yeah.
Question for Angela. One attendee is wondering whether there are any books you'd recommend, either on widows or on love, marriage, the topics you addressed tonight. And of course, I've already recommended your own book, which will be out soon. Are there others you would recommend?
Sure. So I cheated and I peeked at the questions when Dr. Green was talking. And so I was like, oh, good. I'm so glad I'm in my office so I can grab books from behind me. So unfortunately, there aren't any there's not extensive research on widows north or south yet. So UNC Press is where my book's coming out next year. Fingers crossed if everything stays on timeline. But this book, This Republic of Suffering by Druga and Faust, is a fantastic overview of death in the Civil War, and it covers a lot of the emotional themes that I mentioned. And then I recently came across this one, I Remain Yours, Common Lives, Civil War Letters. It's actually by an English professor, but it's fantastic because again, it's North and South, and it's just the themes that he's able to pull on. And he includes a lot of letters. So for me, as y'all could probably tell from my presentation, the words are everything for me. I love the storytelling, and I love seeing it and getting it from their perspective as much as I can. So those would be two that I'd recommend to start with.
Have to look into those myself. For Dr. Green, there's a wonderful question about where you're finding these porch memories that you've referred to. Are these in family histories? Are they being passed down orally? Is it combination? Where are you finding these? And maybe some guidance on how people in the audience can look for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I will tell you, my own family porches is how I knew about Joseph Winters and others, because my mother's family's from historically Franklin County. So I grew up with these stories all the time, but every porch I go to in the African-American community, they're like, let me tell you about my Civil War. So like having this, so one of the things now I find is genealogy societies, because a lot of them post roots Roots is a phenomenon. A lot of those communities start to publish them and have them posted in their community archives. So Franklin County and Chambersburg, they have several families of these. So it's like over and over and over again. But Black newspapers, but also the digitalization of newspapers. With Negro History Week, Black History Month, you'll start to see columns and local people write in. So some of that early publishing of these stories, and then someone will write in like, I heard this differently, and I correct. So sometimes the letters to the editor. But one of the things that really is the communities I'm tied to, people always tell me, what about our family? What about here? And it's usually on their porch or their backyard or in front of their church that they're sharing these with me. So being a steward of this and having this, by having these conversations. So think about relationship building, how to get them. But a lot of them are now community-based archives, and local genealogies, historical societies are having them too.
Thank you.
Great. Another one for Jack Davis. Do you have good examples of occasions when telegrams really affected the outcome of a battle? Or there's another question as well about what kind of a difference newspapers made to the war effort, whether in the North or the South. So what, I guess the question is, what impact did either telegrams or newspapers have on the actual fighting and the outcome?
I think the telegram in particular, or telegraph, had a lot of influence, especially in attempts or efforts to coordinate military movements over a large span of territory. I think, for instance, of when James Longstreet took a considerable portion of his corps in the fall of 1863 out of Virginia and west to join Braxton Bragg's army to wind up fighting at Chickamauga and later at Chattanooga. That whole thing, they went by rail, but the whole thing was coordinated by telegram in advance of the trains carrying the troops running by rail. That's not to say they wouldn't have gotten there without it, but the use of the telegraph helped to prevent the kind of a log jam that might have delayed Longstreet's arrival. Newspapers, I would say, less so, except for their role in keeping people at home informed of what's happening. They got the micro view from their husbands and sons and brothers who were in the armies. They got the macro view from the newspapers. And I think they had a tremendous morale effect. Such an effect, in fact, that the Confederate authorities and occasionally Union authorities would practice press censorship in order not to see depressing news appear in the press.
Great. I will move on to another question for Dr. Elder, who had some wonderful stories contained in those letters. And so there's a question about practical marriages, particularly after the war with returning soldiers. A question about, how often did young women and widowed mothers marry men who had been soldiers for pensions, for help on the farm, for these practical reasons, and what kind of impact did that have?
Yeah, absolutely. It does happen. So at the time, widows are supposed to mourn for 2.5 years. So she's not supposed to enter into another courtship for that time. But we do see exceptions to this of young women who either have some of them have the financial means and they are just not willing to wait the 2.5 years, but some of them seem to do it for reasons for financial security, for opportunities, for worrying that there's not going to be another option. So that's starting to happen a little bit during the war. After the war, so Confederate soldiers aren't getting pensions immediately after the war, but those kind of practical support networks, it happens a little bit, but not a ton. But I would say it's more in like the early 1900s that we see more and more of this. And so the infamous example would be Alberta Martin, who I think she's 21 when she marries a Confederate veteran who's in his 80s. And so she lives on and she doesn't pass away until the early 2000s. She gets all of this claim for being the oldest living Confederate widow, and becomes this pop culture icon of sorts. And so we do, and she very openly says things like, it's good to be it's good to be an old man's darling, and that she did it in part for the pension check that she's going to have. She didn't have many other opportunities. So for sure that, yeah, certainly not all marriages were love matches, even afterwards. Mhm.
Hashtag not all marriages.
A question for Hilary.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your notion of the porch as kind of the place where memories are transmitted. And my question, this is from me, by the way, I can't resist asking my own, even though there are others out there, is do you feel like the porch tradition is dying? And if so, what are the implications for the ongoing transmission of memories about the Civil War?
Yes, it is, and that's what it's one of the concerns, because a lot of it has to do with post-civil rights. What is progress? Moving around. People also have moved, so families are separated out. Distances aren't there. The spaces of the Great Migration and those demographics. But honestly, the people who kept the history are dying. And they're dying, and they have this notion of how old you are to get the real history, and they layer it, but they're not sharing it to a generation that wants to hear it. So one of the things that I'm fighting against is some of the people who did some of these things and writing, trying to get them on recorded and get in their histories before they're gone, because if they're not in the archives, if it's not there, no one knows them, it's going to be a hard thing to how to verify and corroborate through them. So for me, and also that means I had to take on a role that I didn't think I was ever going to take on. That's the family genealogist. And if you would have asked me years ago, I'm like, nope, I'm just going to listen. I'm just going to do this. But now I know more of the stories, and it's the older people, the community, who are like bombarding me with it because they're afraid it's going to die out.
Excellent point. For Dr. Davis, there was a question regarding how the Telegraph could make a difference on the battlefield itself, and if you have a favorite story of falsified information affecting the outcome of a battle.
I think once action actually commenced, was engaged, the Telegraph really is no longer a practical use. Things are moving too quickly. Troops are moving too quickly. The Telegraph itself is too susceptible, because to be close enough to be useful, it's got to be in the line of fire. I can't off the top of my head think of instances in which false information had an impact on the outcome of a battle. Move on, and if something comes to me, a little light will go on over my head, and I'll let you know.
It always happens.
I would like to point out one thing, however, to Dr. Elder. I mentioned these letters by General Wharton. That I've never seen a collection of letters like it. It's 524. They wrote every day. Sometimes they wrote 2 or 3 times a day. But they hardly knew each other when they got engaged in March of 1863. But he gets her permission to start writing to her. And then the interesting thing is, you see how 2 people get to know each other in their letters, and to find out things they had no idea about beforehand, and some of which they're not real happy with. But out of that sort of epistolary courtship grew a very deep and abiding, long-lasting love. In fact, that it's not just people, it's not just folks like some of the examples you used, Pender and others, who are already married and learned and pretty well know each other. It's interesting to see what letters can show us about the eye-opening effects of getting acquainted.
And it's fascinating too, right? Because so much of courtship we don't get, because so much of courtship before the war, it's all of the walks and the conversations, and they happen in parlors, and they don't write them down. And so the war, I think, forces them to write it down. And so, yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. You're exactly right, that in some of these early courtships, you get to see them fall in love or not fall in love over the course of the mail as they get to know one another, because they have no other way to do it if you don't write it down. I mean, there's no stolen moments if you're not physically together. So
I guess the same would be true for some of the moments of tension you explored in your talk as well. Those are things that might not have been written down in normal circumstances. A quick follow-up for Jack. Somebody is asking about the publication date for the Wharton letters.
It's still under consideration at UNC Press. It's taking a long time, as is the case with university presses do not move at telegraph speed. Everyone here knows.
You're not flashing any of us.
No.
No, there's very little flash. So I don't know. I'm hoping that they'll be out
Yeah.
next fall. It's an interesting story. I hope everyone here who hasn't had this experience gets to have it. These were sitting unknown in a trunk in an attic in Radford, Virginia, until about 2010. Even the family living 2 floors down didn't know they were there because they were sufficiently uncurious that they never looked in their own attic. And it's got to be a feeling like being Neil Armstrong or Christopher Columbus to open a trunk and get to go through that sort of thing. It's one of the things that makes us all stay on as historians. That and the fabulous pay.
Absolutely.
Well, I would ask that the attendees wait to run up and check their own attics until 8:30 Eastern time when we're done. We've got a little while longer to go yet, but definitely a good thing to do. A question for Angela about marriage during the Civil War. How did it change? You know, was it possible to have a normal wedding, or was it just a case of doing the best you could in difficult circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, so it certainly varies. Let's see, how do we put this? Most couples did wait or hope to have at least some family members there, but there are higher and higher cases where brides seem to be asking for forgiveness, not permission, right? That if they have the opportunity to marry, even if their father is away at war, if their brothers are not there, we see a lot more of those letters. And then their husband too will write these letters to try to uphold some of the custom of asking for a family's blessing. It doesn't always happen. And it seems to be a little bit more flexible at this time because of this. We definitely see more young women who are traveling to be with their soldier husband, even for just a short time, but it's still relatively uncommon. Most women do stay home or with family. That was a really interesting dynamic to study, was the relationship with a recently married wife with her in-laws, especially. So we get a situation where there are a lot of widows who are pregnant at the time that they become widowed. And if the marriage had been very short, there's a lot of conflict sometimes between the widow and the mother-in-law. So the mother-in-law often writes about how unnatural it is that she's outliving her son. She's processing her own grief. She's struggling with the fact that he is gone, and almost has this natural impulse of, well, his son, or his daughter, or his, the biological child, I could raise that person, which obviously then runs into conflict with the actual birth mother of that child. It's really interesting, right? We think of orphan today, and orphan is someone who has lost both of their parents. Well, during the Civil War era, when they refer to orphan children, that's someone who's lost their father. Even if their mother is still alive, they're considered to be orphaned. And so that's an interesting dynamic in marriage that I wasn't aware of at all until I started kind of going down this path. And of course, some daughter-in-laws and mother-in-laws got along really well, but it depends. It's, just like today, it depends on the personalities. It depends on what other resources. If the daughter-in-law is really close with her family, she might want to go back to her birth family. Or if she is not close to them at all, she might be running to her husband's family as fast as she can. And again, especially in the South, because things get so challenging for the majority of Southern families, having that community is essential to surviving and then putting things back together after the war. So, yeah.
Got a question for Dr. Green from one of our speakers from a couple weeks ago, Emmanuel Dabney, who says, "This is amazing." He's reminded of his granny Pearl being on her porch and talking about Jim Crow life. So have you found much in the way of scrapbooks in the South documenting slavery, the war, emancipation? And then I'm going to tack my own question onto that, which is, how do you feel about having family documents entering into the archives, taking them out of these private collections and putting them in the archives? What are your thoughts on that?
So the first thing, yes, one of the things I find fascinating is photography. We have cases of literacy and different things. One of the things we start to see, especially in the South and then places of scrapbooking, are communities documenting everything, every Memorial Day presentation, every single reunion. And one of the two important things I had gotten were from estate sales. So I shop estate sales. I get families who then sell or donate to the archive. But at the Jamestown Tricentennial event, I have a picture of a mother and daughter in their finest, and they took the picture of them there in the sleeve that said they attended. But then they also bought the postcard with the Negro building on it, and it was never used. And on the back, you can see where the photo corners were. And it's like where that mark was and how they kept this together, and that how they can communicate in there. And so having this alongside this event, and then the program itself that talks about from slavery to Jim Crow and how they're using it, it's through that I can like, oh wait, they're scrapbooking. And in the scrapbooks, especially the marginalia, you start to see the death of former enslaved people that get reported. They'll be copied and pasted and put in these things. So this is where you see that dialectic from the porch. And then also too, that an alternate library source. So you have the books, and they have all the Black history books, and then they have this, then they have the Negro History Week, and then all those events, the Black parades, the Memorial Day parades, the veteran parades, and you see generations. And all the time at those events, they either start at the church, end at a church, but there's always a picnic. And I know from my experience, picnics with elders, you sit here. And one of the things I have to say about parenting, children are to be seen and not heard. So in this space, children are silent, they are listening because they're expected to. So you start to see these roles and this transmission. So Charles Cruz, that's my cat crying behind the door there. It's like he could recall the porch in the 80s and how his family told him this over and over again. The other one was like, I was marching alongside of him in this. Those are the memories that you remember in those porches and those times. And that's why I think it's there. And that dialectic from slavery to Jim Crow to the civil rights movement, it's that always that source to fight on that continue, and that sacrifice of that earlier generation that comes through. Oh, then the question about the archives. I feel weird about it, but I'm happy because archives are now collecting Black memory. So it's going from the porches to the attics, to the museums, to the archives, into historians' hands. So I'd rather go to an archive than to someone's porch like, hi, can I get that picture and scan and go to your box in your attic? And I have done that I can go to an archive and do that type of work instead.
Thank you. So this question is connected, I think, to either of the first two papers. It's about letters home and desertion rates and what the effect was, if any, on letters from home, I should say, on the desertion of soldiers.
Okay, I can start on it. Yes, it's something that both sides are very concerned with. And so we see a lot of pressure that's put on women to champion their husbands or their brothers or their fathers, their male cousins, I mean, everything. And we see that in all sorts of different ways. So one example would be the newspapers. The newspapers publish stories of women who are supportive, who are championing the cause, whether that be North or South, right? Who are pouring their resources, physical and emotional, who are giving speeches that say, if I were a man, you know, I would be out there, or brides who are taking their wedding dresses and sewing them into a regimental flag and sending it off. And so there is this concern that it's going to lead to desertion rates. There are some cases for sure of men who leave because they know things are so terrible at home. And so I think it has an effect for sure.
There's that famous letter I think Belle Wiley first brought to light. I believe it's at the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, in which a wife writes to her husband, William, and talks about how destitute they are, how their children are fading away from hunger. And she says, and before God, William, if you do not come home, we shall all surely die. That's a fairly extreme example, but I'm sure it's hardly unique. And it was pretty tough, I think, for soldiers at the front. especially when they're hundreds of miles away from home. And especially, again, perhaps for Confederate soldiers who know there may be federal armies moving around through their home territory, so they're even more worried about the safety of their families. You're forced to choose your first loyalty in a moment like that.
Just realized I was still muted. Sorry. No matter how many times I'm on Zoom, I still do that. Got a mention about the Edward Cooper letter being fake. Is that an issue that you all have to contend with in looking through these stories and these resources, kind of contending with maybe things that are being replicated that aren't necessarily accurate or correct?
I know for me, one of the things I've done is I take those port stories, but I treat them like all other sources. So I get to correct some false narratives that go in there too. And I'm like, no, this didn't happen. And Joseph Winters is a good example of that. He wasn't a likable man. He writes nice songs, but he also would not lend to people. And if he didn't like you, he told you. So when he dies, he writes this letter to his son, "You are a disappointment to me." After the Civil War, the Black community is like, we didn't like him. So there's some couple things that they spread around him to like decenter him because he wasn't likable. And I have to be the one like, no, he did this. He did not do this. There's no evidence over there that he did this. So it's really treating those with care, acknowledging and doing that type of work as well.
I expect everybody's familiar with the LaSalle Pickett letters. And how she virtually imagined about half of what's in them. They're extremely unreliable, as she tried to deify her husband, George Pickett. George McClellan, of course, greatly edited and improved his letters from during the war in his memoir. And I'm not up to speed on this, Paul, perhaps you are, that I think for 30 years there's been some debate about how authentic the Sullivan Ballou letter is. The original, if it survives, versus what was on the Ken Burns show.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the current thinking is on that either, honestly. But I think it's a problem we all contend with, especially with, we've talked about family archives. There's obviously that incentive to, romanticize the memories of the relatives who fought in the war, or any kind of relative for that matter. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's very subtle, but I think it's always an issue in these family archives.
And when you're dealing with memory, the farther away, of course, you get from the event, the more careful you've got to be. Dr. Green, I'm curious, have you found anything in the pension files for Black troops? Because they often had to get somebody to write in and attest to their service.
Yeah, so the pension's been good. Also, the Freedmen's Bureau records, especially for the mothers whose children are taken during the Civil War, because they had to, go to the Freedmen's Bureau office in Virginia. They had to have affidavits by white members of their community before the Freedmen's Bureau even accepts them. And then they have to navigate the return to find them. So they start seeing the pensions, they start seeing that. But the one of the challenges I'm finding is a lot of these women their children live until like the mid 1960s and 70s. So as a result, some of these pensions are at the Veterans Affairs. And I have had horror stories trying to get my own family members Civil War pension because they died in the 60s. And I had to write and get FOIAs and do everything else. So it's not in the archives. So it's trying to find the ones that are there, but it's the other ones who did not apply, who did not go through, or within these walls having to circumvent. But yeah, the pensions are one of those great sources as well.
And that's been a theme that's kind of run through many of our events at the center this year. Several of our speakers, including Caroline Newhall, have been using the pension files as a really critical resource. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I want to throw out a general question for everyone to answer if you like. If you had about 30 seconds to explain the importance of the resource you spoke about tonight to the outcome of the Civil War, what would you say? And maybe we just go in the same order as the talks. So Jack, this has come up in a couple of your previous responses, so feel free just to say, I I've already answered that question, if you like.
I've already answered that question. No, I think it comes down to speed. And one thing the Telegram does as well that I didn't mention is because of the time it does take to key it in, because of the cost, for instance, if you are actually paying for it, which of course the government doesn't, it encourages brevity and conciseness. You have to know, a commander has to know how to say what he wants in very few words to make it absolutely clear so there could be no mistake, because you can't just write an essay at a telegram. And but overall, I think what it really does come down to is the speed. It really launches us in the information age, when speed with the railroad, speed with the telegraph, really change Americans' notions of how and how quickly information is going to be received.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so for mine, I would say, you know, to use a modern example, think about when you have an argument with your partner or your parents or your friends, right? Some of us are great at multitasking and focusing on the day ahead, and some of us are not, right? It echoes with you, it stays with you. And I think especially at this time when you are at the mercy of whenever the mail is going to bring the next letter, those emotional ties to home mattered greatly, as far as the effect it had on a soldier's mind and the task that he's doing on any given day. If he feels like things are going well at home and he's got the love and support of the people at home, that's going to help him focus. And if not, well, it all depends on the person, I guess.
Yeah, for me, Civil War soldiers, especially Black USCT, really took to arms that they were going to be remembered, and that after the war, as the memory of how the war's construction, they are making sure that they are being remembered by the communities that matter, the ones that they liberated and the ones that supported them during the war. So that tradition to be remembered and to remember, and that overall generation as a will to fight on the battlefield, but also the cultural memory wars persisted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking about that phrase. We often use refighting the Civil War, and, you know, memory is the tool or the weapon that people have used to refight the Civil War generation after generation. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. I would love to continue our conversation, but that's all. And I really want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I want to thank the audience for bringing some great questions and giving us a reason to sit here behind our computers and talk. So we really appreciate you being here, especially, you know, we recognize that this format isn't ideal for anyone. So thank you very much for coming along and asking questions. I also want to thank the staff at Continuing and Professional Education, Leland Shelton and Caroline Honeycutt. All 3 weeks, they've ensured that everything ran very smoothly, so we appreciate that. I would like to thank the donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies. This year, we were able to offer the event for free. Of course, the overheads were much, much lower because of the Zoom format, but they were not zero, and it's because of the generosity of our donors over the years that we were able to offer the event for free, so thank you very much. And finally, thanks to our 3 speakers. You did a wonderful job. I really enjoyed your talks. It was obvious from the questions and the comments we received that the audience did as well. So I really want to thank all 3 of you very, very much. And I hope I see everyone at future events. Hopefully I can actually see you at Civil War Weekend next year, March 25th through 27th, 2022. And before then, you can continue to learn about Civil War history. We have a couple of online lectures coming up in April. You can go to the website, civilwar.bt.edu. If you've been paying attention tonight, it's right down there. And find out about all our future events. You can register for those 2 lectures in April right now. So thanks very much to everyone. Have a good night.